Hello, my name is Wes Harvell, and I'm with Jackson and Perkins. Actually, it's JPPA, Jackson and Perkins Park Acquisition. It includes Jackson and Perkins, Park Seed, and Wayside Gardens. And here I have my friend Diane from the ARS. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Wes, and I'm so glad to be here with you today talking about roses.
Well, I'm looking out your back window there, and I said, I bet you are ready to talk about roses.
Yeah, we're a little behind the season this year in Wisconsin, but that's okay. Things are starting to grow, and I'm starting to prune.
Well, it looks like our topic today is caring for your roses for spring. This is a big topic. Where do you want to start?
Well, why don't we start with your buying quality plants? How does that sound? Because I think that's first thing when you're starting to plan your new garden.
I agree.
So when you think about buying plants for your garden, it's really like buying any other plant. You want to buy a good quality plant, right? And today we're really fortunate because hybridizers are really focused on delivering rose bushes that are disease resistant, that are hardy, and that are fragrant. So you'll have lots to choose from. Rose growing has never been easier as it is today. I do a lot of online ordering through catalogs because then I get the greatest source of roses, and you have a select group, if you will, if you're purchasing from your local nursery. And I often buy bare root roses because they're often lower cost than buying a full plant, especially if you're going to be shipping a plant in a pot. Obviously, that's going to be more costly to you. And finally, my suggestion would be to avoid those $5.99 specials that you might see at some of the box stores. You don't know when that rose was pulled out of the ground. It might have been months before. It might have been, sitting in the sun. There's all sorts of reasons why you're not quite sure of the quality of the rose bush, not the rose bush itself, but just the care that it's been under. And that might be more of a challenge for you as you're starting to grow your new rose bushes.
And to your point about hybridization, today I call it the golden age of roses. The world is wide open. Roses are coming to the United States from all over the world. There are roses that are being developed in the United States, and it's no longer being determined by a select few companies in the world or in the country, but varieties that are coming from everywhere.
That's absolutely true. And even what we've often thought of as that true rose form, if you will, there's a lot of different flower forms out there as well. So there's certainly lots to pick from.
Absolutely. We can go to the next slide. Diane, you look at the list here and you think there's container roses, bare root roses, topic for pruning roses and fertilizing roses. That should take us 2 or 3 hours. Where do we start there?
Well, let's just do some basics, right? So when you're planting a rose bush, let's say it's in a container. Container roses do very well. We're always looking for a rose bush to have adequate sunlight. So roses do need a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of sun a day. And you want it to be planted in good soil. So whether that's in a pot, container, or if you're planting it into the ground, you need to have good soil. And by good soil, I mean something that, it's not clay, right? And that the water and the nutrients are available to the plant. When I'm planting roses in containers, and I've got a few right now, I use more of a soilless mix, if you will, from the garden centers. And then I often add some mulch, not mulch, excuse me. I add some materials to that to make it absorb the water better. So let me say that again to you. If I'm planting roses in a container, I use a soilless mix from the garden center, but I often will add to it product to help it, peat moss type of a product that will help it retain water a little bit better. Your roses, if they're in a container, they're going to be in a lot of sunlight. They're going to get heated up faster, and they're going to need more frequent watering. If you're planting a bare root rose, you want to make sure you dig an adequate size hole. And then you want to have like a little cone of soil in the middle that you can put that grafting point on so that the roots all come carefully down from the cone. And then you want to fill it with soil. What I will do is fill it about halfway full of soil. I'll water it really well because you want to make sure that when you're all done with this plant in the ground, that it has soil around the root structure and it doesn't have any air, basically. Then I'd fill it up the rest of the way. I'd water it again, and then I'd actually put more soil up a bit on the canes to just prevent it from drying out while it starts to grow. An important thing to remember if you're growing bare root roses is that you want to have that grafting point, which looks kind of like a fist, and you see your canes coming out of it. You'd like to have that 2 to 3 inches under the soil line if you're growing roses in a colder climate, such as mine. That way, even if there's more dieback in the winter time, the grafting point's under the soil, and you most likely have saved the bush. I grow about 200 roses in my rose garden, and I rarely lose a bush, and I do very little winter protection. And that's one of the reasons why. It's how I plant them.
Yeah, I always think of roses aren't really magic. They either freeze to death or dry out somewhere in the process, and there's a lot of opportunities for that to happen.
Right.
One great point that you made was, watering that bare root plant as you are planting it, getting all those air bubbles out of there. It just helps so much. If you don't have a soil contact or moisture contact to a root, there's an air bubble, that root portion could die. So adding water as you backfill is very important. And I think too, container size is really important. As you talk about, when it gets hot, those roses require a lot of moisture. And I say at least a 15-gallon pot to get the size that you need to keep it from getting overheated during the summer months.
Right. And that will depend upon where you live and the type of plant that you're growing, right? So here in Wisconsin, I can grow roses in 5 and 7 gallon pots, right? You might need a 15-gallon container where you live in a warmer climate where you're going to have a larger growth and more time for that plant to grow. So it depends on the variety and the climate that you live in. We actually, in Wisconsin, we have people that grow climbing roses in containers as well.
Well, how do you feel about spring pruning? Everybody always talks about, pruning your roses for form and shape and size, but where do you start, Diane?
Yeah, well, the one thing I like to tell people is that you don't need to worry about hurting your plant, right? Unless you cut off the grafting point, which is probably under the soil line, you're not going to kill the plant. So what you want to do, though, is you want to take out all of those darkened or dead canes. You want to clean it out, take out the twiggy growth, and what you're looking for is to have the growth going outside of the bush so that you don't have crisscrossing canes in the middle of your plant. By doing that, you're going to have more air circulation through your plant. And that's going to help keep it from getting a lot of disease. Now, depending upon the variety, even once you cut out all of the dead material, you might still have a large size plant, right? So you want to make sure you cut back a bit, if you will. Even in California, where they don't have winter there like I do, they still do pruning on their rose bushes, and they'll cut them down a bit. And that'll help stimulate more healthy cane growth. Even roses that have been growing a long time can benefit from getting some of that growth, or some of that pruning, if you will. For brand new rose bushes, you rarely need to do much pruning right away in the spring, because it's all new growth and it's all great healthy canes. So there's not much to do there with a new bush.
Well, how do you feel about the conversation where people talk about cutting to the outside eye or cutting to the next fifth leaf formation. I mean, is that important?
Uh, it's important for a couple of reasons, but if you don't do it, you're still going to be okay, right? When people talk about cutting down to the next 5 leaves, so that's a leaf that has 5 leaves on it coming out. The reason that has been a nice little rule, if you will, is because the size of the cane is going to be a little bit larger. And what you're going to see then is any new growth that comes out from where you cut that cane is going to come from there. So if you have a larger cane, then you're going to be able to have a stronger growth coming out, especially if you've got large roses or a spray of roses, right? You might have smaller roses if you cut it up after a 3-leaf, for example. So that's one of the I think backgrounds between cutting down to a 5-leaf is you get stronger canes producing bigger flowers going forward. Cutting out so that the eye again is facing outward will help to shape the plant, and it'll prevent some of that crisscrossing of canes in the middle of the plant so that you have that air circulation that's going through there. It's important, especially for things like black spot disease, which many plants today, frankly, they're much more disease resistant from years ago. But by having those leaves dry off faster, there's less likely chance that they'll have black spot.
Yeah, open centers, and you had referred to air circulation as being very important, and coming back to disease issues, and I agree completely. What about fertilization?
Well, roses really are big feeders. Interesting, a friend of mine in my local rose society once told me he was a farmer all of his life, retired, started growing roses, and he couldn't believe how much roses like to eat compared to his crops in the field. So that I thought was always kind of interesting. First off, you want to make sure your rose has a lot of water. So that's important as you're feeding. You don't want to have a dry or dehydrated plant that you're applying fertilizer to. You might damage the plant when doing that. A simple formula for me is to use a slow releasing type of fertilizer that you can place in the soil, and that'll last maybe half of your summer, depending upon how long your summer is. I actually do reapply mine halfway through the summer, but that's giving a gradual release of nutrients to your rose bush. And then on top of that, I use a water soluble fertilizer every 3 to 4 weeks. And that could be like a 20-20-20 type of fertilizer. Typically, it's some measurement, typically a tablespoon that's dissolved in a gallon of water. But of course, you'd want to make sure that you follow the directions on the label of the material. But that by itself should give you enough fertilizer, if you will, to really take care of your plant for the season. Now, it's important to know if you have an adequate pH in your soil before you start putting a lot of fertilizer down. And the reason is that various nutrients cannot be absorbed if it's not a proper pH for your rose bush. Proper pH is about 6.2 to 6.8. And I just did this a couple of weeks ago. I took soil samples from all of my rose beds and I sent them to our extension service. And then they're going to give me back a report that tells me what my pH is, along with some other elements in my soil. And that way, if I need to amend the soil to adjust the pH, then I can certainly do that. When I was a new rose grower, I was adding all this fertilizer and my plants didn't look real good. And what I found out was that my pH was 8.0. So even though I was spending money, adding all these great fertilizers, the fertilizer wasn't being absorbed by the plant. So be sure to check your pH. And if you don't think your rose bushes look healthy, that might be a good place to start, is to again check the pH.
Yeah, a lot of people don't think of the soil as a living organism, and the actual physical structure of that soil allows the transaction of nutrients to the roots, depending on the pH, like you've mentioned, and also the actual physical structure. That's why you always hear people talk about organic matter. High amounts of organic matter. Mm-hmm. But so very interesting. Do you talk about, do you recommend that people incorporate or work in their dry fertilizers into the soil, or just top dress the soil?
I generally just top dress. I'll scratch in the slow release fertilizer, and then I use a liquid, for every 3 to 4 weeks. The other thing, the more you can amend your soil so that it's just healthy and it's full of the right types of organisms and worms, the better off your soil is going to be. Our Rose Society sells worm casting, so I have been able to take advantage of that, and I put a lot of worm castings in my soil every year.
Yeah, I have friends that use different types of well-rotted manure. Some people compost their leaves and grass clippings. Just worked into the soil to help improve that profile, or that ability for those plants to use that soil. Mm-hmm. We're ready to go to the next slide. Well, there's two very bright and beautiful pictures, but two really big topics. Why don't we start with watering?
Okay. So water, roses like a lot of water, but again, you have to make sure that you've got good drainage. If you don't have good drainage and you're watering your roses well, the roots are going to be sitting in water. And if that happens, then they're pretty much drowning, just like you and I would, if we were, buried in water, so to speak. If you have a lot of clay, one way to get around that is by building your beds up and have a little bit of a raised bed. And that will help you have more depth, so that your rose bush can have more of a drainage, if you will, from the soil base. I water my roses thoroughly every week. Some people say that you shouldn't get water on the leaves. You should water it at the base. I have for a long time done overhead watering, and it's just fine. In fact, I think those roses like a little bit of a bath every now and then, but you want to make sure, if you're using overhead watering, that you do it earlier in the day. That gives the sunlight and the wind time to help dry off those leaves, and again, prevent disease on your plant. So I always tell people, don't go out after dinner and start watering your roses and splashing water all over the place. But otherwise, the rule of thumb is a gallon of water a week. You want to water deeply, not just, shallow with a little bit of water, because that'll help your rose roots grow down deep into the soil.
Yeah, I'd like to think of rose leaves as skin. They have pores, and those pores need to be rinsed and cleaned so they can absorb the nutrients that are added, and also the sunlight that's available. So I also agree that watering in the morning is good, and overhead works fine. It's just reduce that amount of time that those leaves are actually wet.
Right. And then if we look at mulching, by mulching, once you water your plant, then the soil is going to stay a little bit cooler, right? And so it'll be easier from a watering perspective, because the moisture will stay in the plant.
And helps moderate soil temperatures. A lot of things that damage plants are extreme changes in temperature. That mulch works as like a blanket of insulation. And not only does it hold the moisture in, but it can also help the soil temperature extremes be moderated.
Yeah, and it is good for your soil, depending upon the type of mulch you're using. Most of them are going to be breaking down, throughout the year. And that too is providing nutrients to the soil organisms. I use shredded bark in my garden in Wisconsin. I know a lot of my friends use cocoa bean shells as well. They smell so good in the spring when you put them down.
And like you're saying, it just becomes part of the soil and adds to the organic matter. I do prefer what I call a well-rotted mulch, as opposed to something that's green, because I feel like a green mulch will take away from the soil nutrients rather than adding to it. Just a little something that I've learned over the years.
Yep, I absolutely agree with you.
Next slide.
Well, we've covered a lot of topics today. Obviously not in depth, but I think I'm hoping that we gave people some good insight on how to take care of their roses. Roses have, never been easier to grow as they are today, with the incredible number of varieties out there. Again, disease resistant, hardy, fragrant roses. And there's many of them that you can choose from. I would suggest if you have questions about growing roses, you've got some great experts on this call, right? Visit jacksonandperkins.com. They've got a lot of videos out there. You can also go to rose.org and you can connect with our consulting Rosarians. We have consulting Rosarians throughout the country, every state of the country, that are experienced at growing roses in your climate. And that's important because everybody's climate is different, just like you've heard Wes and I talking about today. And then they also have local rose societies across the country that you can visit with, and you can attend their rose shows and learn more about roses that do well in your area.
Great advice, Diane. That local feel, or that local response to roses and local rose societies, those people have been doing this for decades, and they've got varieties they love. They've got fertilizers they love. They know the soils in the area. So that learning curve is dramatically shortened. Very valuable.
Yep, great advice.
I want to talk about this at all, Diane. We didn't talk at all about diseases, and I know that's a big issue, and we didn't talk much about insect control, but we kind of talked on it. But a lot of it has to do with what we've referred to. For example, you mentioned, picking the right rose for the right spot. We talked about, healthy roses, good air circulation, watering certain times of the day. What are your thoughts about disease and insect control?
Yeah, I do not recommend using a lot of chemicals in your garden. You really don't need to. And as we've mentioned, there are a lot of hardy disease-resistant roses today. Insects can easily be taken care of with, washing them off with a water wand, or picking them off and squishing them if you've just got a few. If you get a serious infestation, that might be something that you'd want to use a chemical for. The only thing that I use in my garden is I do use a fungicide for black spot prevention. And you want to prevent it, because if you do get it on some of your plants, it's kind of late, because those spores are so small, you haven't seen them floating around in your yard, and they could be damaging more plants. So I do keep black spot under control through the use of a fungicide. But make sure you read the label and get the right chemical for what you're trying to take care of, if in fact you want to go down that path. But again, you don't have to use a lot of chemicals in really to have a beautiful rose garden.
And a lot of people talk about a clean garden, keeping those old leaves and old sticks and twigs that are old rose canes out of the garden to help reduce disease. So if you're looking at, a healthy plant with good air circulation and good sunshine, and a clean planting area, you're going to cut a lot of your problems down right away.
Absolutely. If you have a winter area, you'll know that some of those diseases will actually carry over, even if you have, dead canes right in the spring. So you absolutely want to get that material away from your plants. Plus, it certainly doesn't look nice, does it?
No, it doesn't. But I think we've covered a lot of topics, and I know there's more to come. We've got future webinars planned, and I want to thank you for your expertise and your time, Diane.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. I look forward to our next conversation.
Hope it'll be soon. Thank you.
You're welcome.